Caleb Harrow hadn't cried since the day they buried his wife. Not once. Not in 5 years. But when he opened his front door at midnight in the middle of a Texas thunderstorm and found a young woman lying face down in the mud with her hands still reaching toward the light, something cracked open in his chest that he thought had been sealed shut for good. He didn't think. He didn't ask questions. He just dropped to his knees in the rain and said the only thing that came to him. "I've got you. You're safe now. I've got you." If this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see just how far this ride has traveled. Now let's go. The storm had been building since sundown. Caleb Harrow knew it the way a man knows weather when he spent 20 years reading the sky over the same stretch of Texas earth. He'd felt it in the pressure behind his eyes, in the way the cattle had pushed toward the north fence all afternoon, in the particular stillness that settled over Dusty Creek before the sky decided to make its intentions known. He'd sent Tomas home early, told him to get across the creek before it rose. He put Eli to bed at 8, the boy barely fighting it, worn out from a full day chasing the 2 barn cats through the hayloft. Caleb had sat on the edge of the narrow bed and watched his son sleep for longer than he needed to, the way he did sometimes, the way he'd started doing after Martha died, and he needed the reminder that something in this world was still exactly where it was supposed to be. Then he'd come downstairs and poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink, and stood at the kitchen window watching the lightning come closer. That was where he was standing when the pounding started. Not a knock. Pounding. Both fists frantic, the sound of someone who had run out of time for manners. He had the door open in 3 strides. She fell when the door gave way. Not into him, past him, hands catching the door frame just enough to keep herself from going all the way down. And then her knees buckled, and she was on the floor of his front hall, soaking wet, chest heaving, one hand pressed flat against the wood like she needed to feel something solid. Caleb crouched down fast. "Hey," his voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "Hey, look at me. Look at me right now." She looked up. The lamplight caught her face, and Caleb went very still. The bruise under her left eye was fresh, dark, the kind of bruise that had been a fist somewhere in the last few hours. There was a cut at the corner of her lip. Her dress was soaked through and torn at the shoulder, and her hands, both of them, now that he was looking, had the red, chafed marks of rope or cord around the wrists. Recent marks. Still raised. She was young, 20, maybe 22 at most, and she was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who has not yet decided whether opening this door was the last mistake they were ever going to make. "You're safe," Caleb said. He said it the way you say something when you mean it with your whole body, not just your mouth. "This is the Harrow Ranch. My name is Caleb Harrow. You're safe here. Do you understand me?" Her eyes stayed on him. She didn't answer. "Can you stand?" Still nothing. But she was breathing. Short, shallow pulls, chest working hard. He put one hand out slowly, palm up, the way he did with a spooked horse, when he needed it to understand he wasn't going to grab. "I'm going to help you up," he said. "That's all. Just up off the floor." She flinched when he took her arm. Full body, instantaneous. The kind of flinch that doesn't come from one bad night. The kind that gets built over time, layer by layer, until the body stops waiting to see what's coming and just assumes. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't let it show in his hands. He got her to the front room, sat her on the old bench by the window, the one Martha had recovered in blue fabric the first autumn they were married. He didn't think about that right now. He went to the kitchen and came back with a lamp, a wet cloth, the tin box he kept bandaging supplies in, and a cup of water. She drank the water before he'd set anything else down. both hands around the cup, 3 long swallows. The cup shook slightly, and she worked hard to control it. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. He pulled the armchair close and sat, which put him lower than her, rather than standing over her. Something in her shoulders came down a fraction of an inch. "Nora," she said. Her voice was barely there, scraped raw at the edges. "Nora Bellwether." "Nora." He nodded like it was ordinary. "You got family nearby, Nora?" Something moved across her face, quick and dark. "No, sir." "Somebody you're trying to get to? A friend? Somebody in town?" "No." She looked at her hands around the empty cup. "The people in town are who I'm running from." Caleb sat with that for a moment. Outside, the thunder rolled in long and low, and the rain came harder against the windows. And somewhere upstairs, he heard Eli shift in his sleep. He thought about the sensible thing, the safe thing. Point her toward the barn, give her dry clothes, wish her well in the morning. Keep his life exactly the shape he'd built it in the last 5 years. Close, contained, nothing in and nothing out. He thought about it for about 4 seconds. "You're staying tonight," he said. "We'll work the rest out come morning." Her eyes came up sharp. "I don't want to bring trouble to you." Trouble. He looked at the bruise on her face. Somebody already decided trouble was coming. It wasn't your decision to make. He held out the cloth. "Let me see to those cuts." She pulled back slightly. "Or you do it yourself," he said immediately. "Your choice entirely. I'll leave the supplies." She looked at him for a long moment, reading him. He stayed still and let her read. "You can do it," she said finally, quiet. "I reckon you can." He cleaned the cut on her lip and the scrape along her cheekbone, and said nothing that wasn't necessary. She sat still through it with the rigid, practiced stillness of someone who has learned to disappear inside themselves while something is happening to the outside of their body. It was one of the saddest things Caleb Harrow had ever seen, and he had seen his share of sad. "Who did this to you?" he asked. He kept his voice flat, conversational. Not a demand, just a question that deserved an honest answer. Her jaw went tight. "A man named Aldous Finch." Finch. Caleb's hands didn't change. "Aldous Finch, who runs the Finch Mercantile and sits on the county board." "Yes, sir." She watched him. "You know him?" "I know his name and his face and the way he shakes hands in front of witnesses." He set the cloth down. "I don't know him well enough to call him a good man." Something very small and very careful shifted in her expression. "My father signed a contract with him," Nora said, "before he died, 3 months ago." She stopped. "Papa was a traveling preacher. We never had much. He was sick, and he was scared about what would happen to me after, and Finch offered him an arrangement. Said he needed a housekeeper, said he'd give me a roof and a wage, and he'd manage the small piece of land Papa had, and make sure it was kept proper until I was old enough to take it over myself." "But that isn't what the contract says," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Is it?" he said. "I found the real papers 2 days ago," she said. Her voice was very steady, the way a voice gets when the terror of something has been sitting with you long enough that you've had to make peace with saying it out loud. He had 2 copies, the one he showed Papa and the one he filed with the county. The one filed with the county signs the land over to Finch outright the moment I turned 23. That's 8 months from now. She pressed her lips together. And there's a clause that says any disputes about the arrangement must be mediated by the county board, which Finch sits on. Which Finch chairs, she said. Caleb set the tin box on the side table. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. She didn't look away. "You show those papers to anybody else?" he asked. "I tried. I went to Sheriff Braddock yesterday morning." Something crossed her face that wasn't quite bitterness, wasn't quite despair. something older than both. He told me I was confused, said I didn't understand contract language, said Aldous Finch was one of the finest men in Dusty Creek, and that a young woman making accusations against a man of his standing could find herself in a great deal of legal difficulty. She paused. He walked me back to Finch's house himself. And that's when Finch did this. He waited until Braddock left. She said it simply. He said the next time I tried to go around him, he'd make sure the sheriff had reason enough to hold me, and that a girl with no family and no standing doesn't win against a man with 20 years of county relationships and a signed contract in the courthouse. Her chin came up. So I stopped thinking about going around him and started thinking about going over him entirely. And you ended up at my door. Your ranch was the farthest from town I could get on foot before the storm hit. She looked at him squarely. I didn't choose you specific. I want you to know that. I wasn't trying to put this on you. Caleb looked at this young woman on his wife's bench, with rope marks on her wrists, and a split lip, and a county system stacked against her, and enough spine to have walked 4 miles through building weather, rather than stay another night under the roof of a man who hit her. What's the land? He asked. She blinked. Sir, your father's land. What is it? Where is it? 40 acres, she said. Out past Cutter's Creek, northeast corner. My grandfather homesteaded it, left it to Papa. Papa left it to me. She paused. It's not much to look at, but it sits on top of the only natural spring in the east section of the county. Finch has been after it since before my father got sick. Water rights on that land are worth considerably more than 40 acres of scrub grass. Caleb stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, and looked at the dark and the rain, and thought about Aldous Finch's face. The handshakes, the county board seat. The way men like that built themselves into a place so thoroughly that removing them felt like pulling a load-bearing wall. And then he thought about what she'd said. 40 acres northeast of Cutter's Creek. He turned around. That land borders mine, he said. East fence line. The spring you're talking about. The water runs down through the drainage into my south pasture. I've been fighting with Finch for 2 years about access rights on that water. Nora went very still. He told me, she said slowly, that the adjacent rancher had already agreed to sell him the access rights. He showed me a letter. I never signed any letter. I know that now, she said. I found that, too, when I found the papers. It was in the same file box. She held his gaze. Mr. Harrow, that letter has your name on it. The kitchen went quiet except for the rain. He forged it, Caleb said. Yes, sir. Show me. He said it immediately. Tomorrow morning, when there's light, you'll show me that file and everything in it. I have it. She reached inside the fold of her wet dress and pulled out a wrapped oilcloth packet, damp on the outside, but intact. I took everything when I ran. I wasn't leaving evidence behind. Caleb looked at the packet in her hands. This girl had been hit hard enough to leave a bruise like that, had run 4 miles in a building thunderstorm, and had still had the presence of mind to take the documents. You've been planning this, he said. Since the night I found the papers. She looked at him without apology. I knew if I ran without proof, I was just a runaway with no family and no ground to stand on. I needed to take everything. She paused. I only got one chance, and I took it. All right, Caleb said. He said it the way he said things when his mind was already 3 steps ahead, and needed the rest of him to catch up. All right. You keep that safe. Tonight you sleep in the back room, door bolts from the inside, and I mean that. In the morning, Tomas will be here before sunup, and there are things we need to move on before Finch realizes where you are. She looked at him with that careful, measuring look. Why? She asked. Just that. One word, stripped down to the bone. Caleb thought about giving her something easy. He wasn't built for easy. Because he put a forged letter with my name on it in a county file, he said. And that makes this my problem, whether I chose it or not. He held her gaze. And because nobody should be sleeping in the mud outside a stranger's door in a thunderstorm, because the people who were supposed to protect them didn't. He turned to go. "Mr. Harrow," he stopped. "My father thought he was protecting me," she said. Her voice was careful, like she was testing whether the words would hold her weight. "When he signed that contract, he genuinely thought Finch was a decent man doing a charitable thing." She paused. "He died believing he'd left me somewhere safe. I don't want to spend the rest of my life being angry at him for that. I just—" She stopped. "I know," Caleb said, without turning around. She waited. "My wife," he said. "She made me promise to keep the ranch, no matter what happened. She said it 3 different times in the last month before she died, like she was worried I'd let it go." He was quiet for a moment. "I've spent 5 years honoring that promise, when most days the ranch felt like the thing I was least sure I wanted to hold on to." He exhaled. "People make promises and decisions for the people they love with the best information they have. Doesn't make them foolish, just makes them human." Nora didn't say anything, but when he glanced back, the expression on her face was different from any he'd seen on it yet. Not fear, not calculation. Something open and quiet and surprised. "Bolt the door," he said. "I'll be up before first light." He went to the kitchen and stood at the table with his hands flat on the wood and listened to the rain come down on the Montgomery, the Harrow Ranch, and thought about a file with a forged letter bearing his name, and 40 acres sitting on a spring that watered his south pasture, and Aldous Finch's face smiling at the county board table like a man who has never once had to wonder whether the room was on his side. Around 2 in the morning, he heard soft footsteps in the hall, the creak of the back room door, water running briefly in the washroom. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of another person alive in the house. He hadn't heard those sounds in 5 years. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to them, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't name. He wasn't ready to name it. He just let it be what it was. The simple, complicated, terrifying fact of the house not being empty anymore. And sat with it in the dark until the rain started to slow and the first thin light began at the edge of the sky. When Tomas Reyes arrived at first light, as he always did, he came through the back door without knocking, with his hat in both hands, and his eyes moving across the kitchen the way they always moved. Taking inventory, making assessments, arriving at conclusions faster than most men half his age. He saw the 2 cups on the table, the damp cloth folded by the basin, the second lamp burning low on the counter. He looked at Caleb at the stove, making eggs. "You got company," he said. It wasn't a question. "Don't," Caleb said, flat. "I wasn't saying anything." "You were fixing to." Tomas set his hat on the counter and leaned against the wall with his arms folded, and the expression he wore when he was being strategically patient. "She got a name?" "Nora Bellwether. Her father was the preacher who passed in April." Tomas went very quiet. The particular quiet of a man deciding what he knows and what he says. "You know that name," Caleb said, looking at him. "I know that her father signed papers with Aldous Finch before he died," Tomas said carefully. "I know there's been talk, quiet talk, the kind that stays quiet because nobody wants to say anything about Aldous Finch, in a town where Aldous Finch signs the leases and sits on the county board and shakes hands with the sheriff on the front steps of the courthouse every Thursday morning." "What kind of talk?" Tomas looked at him steadily. "The kind that says the arrangement ain't what it was presented to be. The kind that says that girl has been working that house without wages and without leave since April. And any time somebody from church tries to visit, she ain't available." He paused. "And the kind that says she turned up at Sunday service 3 weeks ago with a bruise she covered with her collar and pretended wasn't there." Caleb set the spatula down. "She's staying," he said, "long as she needs." Tomas nodded once, the nod of a man who expected exactly this and had been waiting to hear it confirmed. "Finch will come looking," he said. "I know. He'll come with paper and Braddock and the full weight of a county that has no reason to question the word of a board chairman against a girl with no people." "I know that too." Caleb plated the eggs. "Which is why we're going to have more paper than he does before the day is out." He looked at Tomas. "I need you to ride to Harlan after breakfast. There's a woman there, a woman named Clara Webb, who practiced law in this state before she married and moved out this direction. She settled near Harlan 3 years back. You know her?" Tomas's eyebrows moved. "I know of her. Go and tell her I need her here by tomorrow morning," Caleb said. "Tell her the situation plain, and tell her that a man with 20 years in this county and a clear title on 2,500 acres is asking her personally. Tell her I will pay whatever she asks, and that if she's interested in a case worth her full attention, she just found one." Tomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You've known about Clara Webb this whole time?" "She helped me with a water rights dispute 18 months ago. Correspondence only." He looked at Tomas. "Finch's lawyer is a man named Holt, who Finch has been paying for 12 years. I need someone who isn't in anyone's pocket in this county." "And the girl?" Tomas said. "She know you're doing this?" "Not yet." Tomas picked his hat back up. Something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite a smile, but was made of the same material. "She's going to ask you why," he said. "You know that. She's going to ask you why you're doing this for somebody you found on your floor 8 hours ago." Caleb carried the 2 plates to the table. "I'll tell her the truth," he said. "Which is?" He set the plates down. He stood for a moment with his hands on the back of the chair, looking at the 2 cups he'd set out without thinking twice about it. The second plate he'd made the same way. And the lamplight and the rain tapering off outside the window. And the knowledge of a forged letter with his name on it sitting in an oilcloth packet in the back room. "Because she walked 4 miles in a thunderstorm, and she still had the presence of mind to take the evidence," he said. "And because a man who had hit a woman who just lost her father and forge a dead rancher's signature on a county document is not a man I can look at across a board meeting and pretend I don't know what he is." He pushed the chair in. "And because my son is 8 years old, and he's watching everything I do, and I want him to understand what a man does when he sees something wrong." He looked at Tomas. "Bad enough?" Tomas put his hat on. "That's plenty," he said. "I'll be back by evening. Don't open the front gate for anyone you don't know." "I never do," Caleb said. Tomas went out the back. Caleb stood at the stove and listened to his horse move out of the yard. And then he turned and found Eli standing in the kitchen doorway, in his boots and his shirt half untucked, hair still sideways from sleep, looking at the 2 plates on the table with the focused attention of an 8-year-old encountering a fact that required explanation. "Papa," Eli said, "who's the other plate for?" Before Caleb could answer, Nora Bellwether appeared in the hallway behind his son. She'd pinned her dress back together at the shoulder and combed her hair and washed her face. And in the morning light, the bruise on her cheekbone was darker, yellowing at the edges. And she stopped when she saw the boy, and the boy turned and looked up at her, and neither of them moved. Eli stared at her face. He was 8 years old, and he had not yet learned to pretend he hadn't seen something. "Did somebody hurt you?" he asked. Nora looked at the boy. Something in her face went very gentle and very honest at the same time. "Yes," she said, "but I'm all right now." Eli considered this for a long moment with the gravity of a child doing important moral arithmetic. Then he looked at his father. "Is she staying with us?" "For now," Caleb said. "Her name is Miss Bellwether." Eli looked back at Nora. "I'm Eli. Papa makes good eggs. You hungry?" And Nora Bellwether, who had not smiled in longer than she could remember, almost did. "Yes," she said. "I reckon I am." She sat down across from the plate Caleb had made without being asked to, and Eli climbed into his chair beside her and began talking about the barn cats, as if she'd been at this table his whole life. And Caleb stood at the stove with his back to both of them and felt the size of his house settle around 3 people instead of 2. He didn't look at the empty 4th chair. Not this morning. This morning, he just made coffee and listened to his son explain the difference between the 2 cats' personalities to a young woman who had been beaten and lied to, and had still walked 4 miles through a storm with evidence in her dress, and had woken up this morning and sat down at a stranger's table and answered an 8-year-old's questions like it was the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the storm was gone. The sky over Dusty Creek was clean and blue and brutal in the way of Texas summer mornings, when the heat comes back fast and hard after the rain like it never left, like it was just waiting for the water to clear before it pressed down again. Somewhere in town, Aldous Finch was waking up. Caleb knew that the same way he knew weather. He didn't need to see it to know it was coming. He poured 3 cups of coffee and carried them to the table and sat down. "All right, Miss Bellwether," he said. "After breakfast, I need you to show me everything in that packet." She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at him with eyes that had already, in 8 hours, learned to read the difference between a man who gave orders and a man who was asking. "Yes, sir," she said. "All of it." Eli reached across and stole a piece of her biscuit without asking, and she let him. And somewhere under the bruise and the exhaustion and the careful management of everything she let herself feel, something in Nora Bellwether's face went quiet and still, in the way of someone who has been bracing so long against what's coming that they've almost forgotten what it felt like when nothing was. Just for a moment, just one breakfast on a clear morning after the storm. Just enough. The documents were worse than Caleb had expected. Not because they were complicated, because they weren't. Aldous Finch had written the fraud cleanly, simply, the way a man writes something when he's confident no one is ever going to look at it closely enough to matter. The real contract, the one filed with the county clerk, the one that didn't match the paper Nora's father had signed, was 2 pages, plain language, transferring full title of the Bellwether land to Aldous Finch upon Nora's 23rd birthday, or upon her marriage, whichever came first. There was a clause about debts, a fabricated list of expenses Finch claimed to have paid on the Bellwether property since the signing. Money Nora's father had supposedly borrowed and never repaid. The kind of paper trail that turns a theft into a legal transaction, if you build it carefully enough, and own enough of the county to make sure no one reads it too closely. The forged letter with Caleb's name on it was the 3rd page. His signature, or something close enough to fool a clerk who'd never seen the real thing, at the bottom of a statement agreeing to sell Finch the water access rights to the South Creek drainage for a sum that was about 1/3 of what those rights were actually worth. Caleb read it twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "He's been planning this since before your father died," he said. "Yes." Nora sat across from him, with her hands flat on the table. "I think he knew about the spring before Papa did. I think that's why he offered the arrangement in the first place. Papa thought he was being shown charity. He was being shown what Finch wanted him to see." "Your father was a good man who trusted the wrong person." Caleb looked at her. "That's not stupidity. That's decency being used against itself." Something moved in her face. She pulled it back quickly. "How long have you known about the water rights on that land?" he asked. "My grandfather told me about the spring when I was small. Said it was the reason the land mattered. that the water made it worth 10 times what it looked like on the surface. She paused. I didn't understand what that meant until I found Finch's file box and saw your name on that letter. He needed my access agreement to make the water rights legally extractable, Caleb said. Without it, even if he gets the land, he can't pull commercial water off it without my consent, because the drainage runs through my property. So he built himself a paper trail. He picked up the forged letter. This is what he was going to use to push me out of the way. Can he? Nora asked. Legally? Not with a forged signature. But proving a forgery takes time, and a lawyer, and a judge willing to look. And Finch has spent 20 years making sure that the path between a complaint and a judge in this county runs straight through his office. Caleb set the letter down. Which is why we're not going through the county. She looked at him steadily. Clara Webb. He'd told her about Tomas's errand over breakfast, straight and plain, the same way he'd told her everything since she'd arrived. No softening, no managing. She'd listened without interrupting and asked 2 questions, both of them precise, and he'd understood by the end that she'd already been thinking 2 steps ahead of most of what he told her. She's a circuit attorney, he said. She practiced in Austin before she moved out this direction. She knows the state land statutes better than anyone Finch has access to in this county, and she has no relationships here that he can use against her. You're doing a great deal for someone you found on your floor, Nora said. She said it carefully, the way she said things that cost her something to say. Your land borders mine, he said, and my name is on a forged document in a county file. That makes this my business regardless. He held her gaze. But that's not the whole answer, and you know it. She waited. A man put marks on your wrists and a bruise on your face and told you the law was on his side, Caleb said. And he wasn't entirely wrong about that, which is the part that makes it worth fighting. Not the easy wrongs, the ones that have been made to look legal. He pushed back from the table slightly. I've got a son upstairs who is watching everything I do, and there are things I want him to understand about what a man does when he sees something wrong. Nora looked at her hands. He's a good boy, she said quietly. Eli. He's the best thing I've done, Caleb said. It came out simple and certain, the way true things come out when you stop worrying about how they sound. She looked up, and for just a second, before she managed it, there was something in her face that was raw and young and aching. The expression of someone who grew up watching a father love her like that, and then lost him, and has been moving through the world since with that specific shape of empty space beside her. I'm sorry about your father, Caleb said. She nodded once, short and controlled. Thank you. He didn't push further. Some griefs don't need to be opened up. They just need to be acknowledged and left room. He reached across and gathered the documents carefully and wrapped them back in the oilcloth. I'm going to put these somewhere safe, not in the house. Where? There's a place in the barn floor that my wife, found useful for things she didn't want Eli getting into. Loose board under the northeast stall. He paused. Eli found it when he was 6, and I had to move her hiding place for Christmas gifts. He doesn't know I know about the original spot. Nora almost smiled again. The same almost as breakfast. He was learning to read the difference between the things that moved through her face fast and the things that she let stay. All right, she said. He stood. Then he stopped. Finch is going to come here, he said. Today, most likely. When he finds you're gone and starts tracking where you could have reached on foot in a storm. My ranch is the nearest property from the East Road, and he knows it. He looked at her directly. When he does, I need you to stay inside. Not because you can't handle yourself. Because I need him to think I'm the obstacle here, not you. If he's focused on me, he's not building a new case against you. Nora looked at him for a long moment. "You're using yourself as a target." "I'm a harder target than you are right now. I've got land and standing and 20 years in this county without a mark against me. He'll have to be careful with me in a way he hasn't had to be careful with you." He held her gaze. "Let me be careful for a day or two, just until Clara gets here." She was quiet. He could see her working through it, the same way she worked through everything, honestly, without flinching from the part she didn't like. "I don't enjoy being told to stay inside," she said. "I know." He reached for his hat. "I'm not telling you. I'm asking." Another moment. Then she said, "All right, ask me again when this is done, and I'll tell you what I think." He was 3 steps toward the barn when Eli appeared at the door. "Papa," the boy said, "there's a man on a horse coming up the track." Caleb looked at the dust rising on the east road, and he knew, before he could make out the face, that it was too soon to be Finch himself. Finch wouldn't come personally first. He'd send someone to confirm she was here before he came with the paperwork and the authority. The rider was a man named Cole Dre, who worked odd jobs around the Finch Mercantile and had the permanent expression of someone waiting to be told what to think. He pulled up at the fence and stayed on his horse, which was either a show of authority or an indication that he planned to leave quickly, depending on how this went. "Harrow," Dre said. "Mr. Finch asked me to ride out. He's looking for a young woman. Girl who works for him. Went missing in the storm last night." Caleb stood at the fence with his thumbs in his belt and looked at Dre for a long moment. "Works for him," he repeated. "That's right. Name of Bellwether. Young woman, dark hair. Mr. Finch is worried about her, storm being what it was." "Worried," Caleb said. Dre shifted in his saddle. "Yes, sir. He asked me to check properties in the East Range, see if anybody'd taken in a stray." Caleb looked at him with the same expression he used when one of his cattle had done something he didn't believe for a second, but didn't feel like arguing about yet. "Haven't seen anyone," he said. Dre looked at the house. Caleb didn't follow his eyes. "Mr. Finch would be grateful," Dre said, "if she turned up anywhere out this way, that she be returned directly to him. He has a legal arrangement with her, and he's responsible for her well-being." Caleb looked up at the sky. "You tell Aldous Finch that if he's got concerns about somebody's well-being, he's welcome to ride out and talk to me directly. I've got time this afternoon." He looked back at Dre. "But you tell him to come alone. I don't entertain crowds on a weekday." Dre opened his mouth and closed it again. "I'll tell him," he said. "You do that." Caleb pushed off the fence post and walked back toward the barn without looking back. He heard Dre's horse turn on the track and go. Inside the barn, he stood in the dark and heat and let out a slow breath and thought about what he'd just done. He'd looked a man in the face and said something that was technically true and functionally a lie. And he'd done it without hesitation, and he did not feel bad about it. And he was not going to feel bad about it, because the only thing standing between Aldous Finch and a girl with rope marks on her wrists was the 48 hours they needed to get Clara Webb on a horse and into this county. "Papa," Eli was in the barn doorway. "I heard," the boy said. He was using his serious face, the one that looked startlingly like Martha's when she was thinking hard about something that mattered. "He was asking about Miss Bellwether." "Yes." "You said you hadn't seen anyone." Caleb looked at his son. He crouched down so they were level, the way he did when something needed to be said properly. "I did," he said. "That's not true." "No," Caleb said. "It isn't." Eli stared at him with those grave, serious eyes. "Why'd you say it?" "Because Miss Bellwether ran away from a man who was hurting her," Caleb said, "and that man sent someone to find her and bring her back. And I'm not going to help that happen." He held his son's gaze. Sometimes the truth needs a day or two to become safe enough to say out loud. You understand? Eli thought about this with the focused intensity of a child who takes moral questions seriously. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked.
That's what I'm working on.
Okay. Eli stood up straight. Can I bring her lunch? She didn't eat much at breakfast. Caleb looked at his 8-year-old son, who had just decided without any further deliberation that the situation was being handled and his contribution would be lunch delivery. Yes, he said, you can bring her lunch. Finch came himself 2 hours later. He did not come alone. He brought Braddock, the sheriff, broad and slow and uncomfortable in the way of a man who has spent too long doing the easy thing and is starting to feel the weight of it. And a younger man Caleb didn't recognize, who rode on Finch's left and kept his expression blank and professional. A hired man. The kind you brought when you wanted the shape of authority without the accountability. Finch himself looked exactly as he always looked. Well-dressed, well-fed, the particular grooming of a man who wants to be understood as prosperous and reasonable. He had the smile already in place when he pulled up. The board meeting smile. The "I'm a patient man" smile. The smile that said all of this could be avoided if everyone would simply be sensible. Caleb stood at the porch steps and waited for them. "Caleb," Finch's voice was warm and carrying. "I appreciate you seeing me. I know you're a busy man." "Aldous," Caleb didn't offer his hand. "I imagine my man Cole came through earlier." "He did." "Then you know what I'm here about." Finch shifted in his saddle. "The Bellwether girl. She's been with me since April, under a legal arrangement made with her late father, God rest him, and she ran off in last night's storm. I'm concerned for her safety." "You said that." "She's young, and she's had a difficult few months, and she's prone to—" Finch paused, with the consideration of a man choosing his words carefully. "To moments of poor judgment. Girls her age, after a loss like that, they can get confused, tell themselves stories, work themselves up." "Stories," Caleb said. "She may have said things to you. If she found her way here." Finch held up a hand. "I want you to know there's no judgment. Whatever she told you, she genuinely believes it. That's the hardest part of this situation." He shook his head with the practiced compassion of a man who had done this before. "I just want to get her home safe. Whatever she's told you about our arrangement, I'm happy to show you the original contract. Everything filed properly and witnessed." "I'd like to see that," Caleb said. Finch blinked. That wasn't the response he'd prepared for. "Of course," he said after a beat. "I can have copies sent over." "I'd like to see the copies filed of the county seat," Caleb said. "Not the ones from your office. The ones in the public record." Silence. Braddock was looking at his horse's ears. "That's an unusual request," Finch said. His voice had changed very slightly, still warm, but something underneath it had gotten careful. "Seems straightforward to me," Caleb said. "You've got a legal arrangement properly filed. I'd like to see the filing. County records are public." He looked at Finch steadily. "Unless there's a reason the filed version and the original version might look different." The smile stayed on Finch's face, but it stopped moving. The way a fire looks when the wind stops feeding it. "Caleb," Finch said, "I've known you for 20 years. You're a sensible man. You keep to yourself. You keep your business clean. You don't get involved in things that aren't your concern." He paused. "This isn't your concern. A forged letter with my name on it in a county file made it my concern," Caleb said. The silence that followed was a different quality than the ones before it. Braddock's head came up. The hired man on Finch's left went very still. Finch looked at him across the fence for a long moment. "I don't know what that girl told you," he said. His voice had dropped the warmth now entirely. Just the flat center of it, the thing underneath. but you need to think very carefully about what you're doing. I have 20 years of relationships in this county. The board, the clerk's office, the bank. You've got a son to raise and a ranch to run, and no wife to help you with either of those things." He let that sit for a moment. Think about what it means to make an enemy of a man who has that kind of reach. Caleb looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Aldous," he said, "I've been in this county 20 years without making an enemy of a single man, and I'd like to tell you why." He stepped down off the porch and walked to the fence until he was close enough that this was a conversation between two men, and not a man on a horse and a man on a porch. "Because I've never had to. Because nobody in this county has ever given me reason enough." He held Finch's eyes without heat, without anger, just the steady certainty of a man who has made up his mind. "You just gave me reason enough." Finch stared at him. "Bring the sheriff back tomorrow morning," Caleb said. "Bring your attorney. Bring whoever you'd like. I'll have my own attorney here, and we'll look at every piece of paper connected to the bellwether arrangement in front of witnesses. That's the offer." He stepped back. "That's the only offer." Finch turned his horse. He didn't say another word. Braddock followed without looking at Caleb. The hired man went last and glanced back once, a quick, assessing look. The look of someone recalibrating what kind of situation they'd walked into. Caleb stood at the fence until the three horses were far enough down the track that the dust was settling. And then he turned and found Eli sitting on the porch steps with a forgotten piece of biscuit in his hand, watching. "Papa?" Eli said. "Yeah?" "Mr. Finch has mean eyes." Caleb looked at his son. The boy was 8 years old, and he'd seen it plain as daylight. "Yes," Caleb said. "He does." He went inside. Nora was in the kitchen. She'd heard. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she was standing at the counter with her hands very still, the same careful, contained stillness he'd been learning to read since last night. She turned when he came in. "He threatened you," she said. "He tried." "Caleb." She said his name for the first time without the "Mr." in front of it, direct and unguarded, and then seemed to notice she'd done it and didn't take it back. "He's going to come back tonight. Not in the morning. Tonight, in the dark, without the sheriff, and without the pretense of doing this legally." She held his gaze. "That's what men like him do when the legal door starts to close. They don't wait. They move fast, and they make the paperwork follow after." "I know," he said. "Then we can't just wait for Clara Webb." "No," he agreed, "we can't." He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table and looked at her. "Tell me everything. Everything about the contract, about the county clerk, about anyone who has seen you with bruises and looked the other way. Every name, every detail you remember. We're going to build something tonight that is solid enough to matter, regardless of what he does next." She sat down across from him, and she looked at him with those clear, careful eyes that had been reading him and recalibrating since the moment she'd opened them on his floor. And she said, "All right, from the beginning." "From the beginning," he said. And outside, the Texas sun pressed down on Dusty Creek like it was making a point. And somewhere across town, Aldous Finch was thinking fast and making plans. And somewhere on the road to Harlan, Tomas Reyes was riding hard. And in the kitchen of the Harrow Ranch, a man who had spent 5 years making his life small enough that nothing could hurt it, was sitting across from a young woman with rope marks on her wrists and a piece of oilcloth full of evidence, and neither of them looked away. They talked for 3 hours straight. Nora told him everything, the way she did all things, methodically, without drama, starting from the beginning and moving forward without skipping the parts that were hard to say. She told him about the contract signing, how her father had been propped up in bed with a fever already in him that they didn't know yet was the one that would kill him. How Finch had come to the house with 2 witnesses and a pen and a voice full of reassurance. She told him about the first month after her father died, how she'd worked the Finch house from before sunrise to after dark, and received no wages, and asked once, and been told the wages were being applied against the debt listed in the contract. She told him about the county clerk, a man named Gerald Sykes, who had a brother-in-law working at the Finch Mercantile, and who had processed the filed contract without judicial review and without question. She told him about the Sunday service 3 weeks back, the bruise she'd covered with her collar, the 2 women from the Ladies' Aid who had seen it and looked away, because looking meant having an opinion about Aldous Finch, and having an opinion about Aldous Finch in Dusty Creek meant losing your husband's lease or your brother's loan, or the particular social standing that women in small towns understood was never entirely secure. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. He wrote down names on a piece of paper. Sykes, the brother-in-law, the 2 women from the Ladies' Aid, a hand at the mercantile Nora had overheard talking about a second property deal Finch was working north of town. When she finished, he read back through the list and asked 2 follow-up questions, both precise, and Nora answered them without hesitation. "You've been building this in your head for weeks," he said. "Since I found the papers." She looked at the list. "I knew if I ever got out, I'd only get one chance to make it stick. I needed to know exactly what I had." "The 2 women from the Ladies' Aid," Caleb said. "Margaret Tillis and Ruth Calloway." Nora looked at him sharply. "You know them?" "Ruth Calloway runs the boarding house on the south end of Maine. She's been a widow 12 years, and she runs that place herself, and she has never once in 12 years asked Aldous Finch for anything, which means she doesn't owe him anything." He tapped the paper. "Margaret Tillis I know less, but Ruth Calloway I know. She's not a woman who looks away because she wants to. She looks away because she hasn't had a reason solid enough to stop." "You think she'd talk to your attorney?" "I think Ruth Calloway has been waiting for someone to ask her the right question," Caleb said. "And Clara Webb is very good at asking the right questions." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You trust her, Clara Webb. You've worked with her before, and you trust her." "I do." "Why?" He looked up from the paper. "Because when I came to her with the water rights dispute 18 months ago, she told me the truth about what I could prove and what I couldn't. And she told me the truth about what it would cost to fight it. And she didn't tell me what I wanted to hear." He paused. "I can work with someone who tells me the truth about costs." Something moved in Nora's expression. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "My father used to say," she said carefully, "that the most dangerous kind of dishonesty is the kind that means well. That a man who lies to protect your feelings does you more harm in the long run than a man who tells you a hard thing plainly." She paused. "I've been thinking about that a lot. About Finch and how well he means. In his own head, I genuinely think he means very well." Caleb looked at her. "That's a generous thing to say about a man who put those marks on your wrists." "It's not generous," she said. "It's accurate. And it's more frightening than if you were simply cruel, because a cruel man knows what he is. Finch doesn't. He genuinely believes he was doing my father a kindness. He genuinely believes that land in my hands is land going to waste, and land in his hands is land being put to good use." She held Caleb's gaze. "That's the man we're fighting. Not a monster. A man who has convinced himself completely." Caleb thought about that for a long moment. He thought about the board meeting smile and the warmth that lived right up to the edge of the cold center underneath. And he thought about how a man like that got away with things for 20 years in a county full of decent people. And he thought that Nora Bellwether, at 22 years old, had understood something about human nature that most people spent a lifetime avoiding. "That's why the public record matters," he said finally. "You can't shame a man who doesn't feel shame, but you can put documents in front of a judge." "Yes," she said, "you can." He folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket and stood up. "I'm going to check the fence line before dark. You stay inside. Eli will be back from the barn by supper." He looked at her. "Lock the back door when I go out." "Caleb?" She said his name the same way as before, direct, without the mister, like she'd decided somewhere in the last 3 hours that they were past that particular formality, and there was no point pretending otherwise. "Be careful on the fence line." He put his hat on. "Always am." He was halfway to the south pasture when he saw the rider. Not Finch, not Dre. A woman, riding hard from the east, on a good horse she clearly knew how to handle, leaning forward in the saddle with the posture of someone who had been moving fast for a long time and wasn't planning to stop until she got where she was going. He recognized the horse before he recognized the rider. Clara Webb pulled up 10 feet from him and swung down in one practiced motion, and she was already talking before her boots hit the ground. "Tomas found me at the Harlan post office at 9 this morning," she said. "I got on the horse at 9:15. She looked at him with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "What do you have?" "More than I expected," he said. "Show me." He took her inside. Nora was in the front room when they came through the door, and she stood up fast, the instinctive brace of someone hearing boots on the floor. And then she went still when she saw the woman with Caleb, and read her face and her bearing, and understood in about 4 seconds what kind of person she was looking at. Clara Webb looked at Nora. She looked at the bruise, the wrists, the particular way Nora was standing, upright and contained and braced. And her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went very focused and very quiet, in the way of someone who has been angry about something for a long time, and is now being given the specific shape of what they were angry about. "Miss Bellwether," Clara said. "My name is Clara Webb. I'm an attorney. Caleb Harrow asked me here, and I came because he asked, and because Tomas Reyes told me enough on the road that I had a fair picture before I arrived." She glanced at the oilcloth packet on the table. "Is that the documentation?" "Yes, ma'am," Nora said. "Sit down, both of you. I need to read everything, and I need to do it without interruption. And then I'm going to ask you questions, and I need complete answers, even if the answers are uncomfortable." She pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down and reached for the packet. "Caleb, coffee if you have it." He made coffee. Clara read. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of papers turning and the occasional scratch of her pen as she made notes in the small leather book she'd pulled from her coat pocket. Nora sat across from her and didn't fidget, which Caleb was learning was characteristic. She went still when she was thinking, completely still, using the silence the way some people used movement. Eli came in from the barn at some point, read the room instantly with the animal accuracy of a child raised around adults who handled serious things, climbed quietly onto the bench beside Nora, and began drawing horses on a scrap of paper without saying a word. Nora looked down at him, and without any discussion, moved her coffee cup to make room for his drawing. He didn't look up. She almost smiled. Caleb watched that small exchange and looked away before anyone noticed him looking. Clara set the last page down. "All right," she said. She looked at Nora. "The filed contract is fraud. That's straightforward. The language in the county filing is materially different from any arrangement a dying man in a sickbed could have meaningfully consented to, and I can make that argument in front of any judge in this state." She paused. "The forged letter with Caleb's name is a separate criminal matter, and it's the sharper weapon because it creates a provable third-party harm, which means I can push for criminal charges rather than just a civil dispute. Civil disputes take months. Criminal charges move faster, and they move publicly. She tapped her pen on the table. Here's what I need. I need Gerald Sykes. The county clerk, Caleb said. He processed a fraudulent filing without judicial review. That's either gross negligence or active participation, and I intend to find out which. A man who is negligent and scared can be useful. A man who is actively participating has reason to cooperate before someone else does it first. She looked at Nora. And I need the 2 women who saw your bruise at Sunday service. Ruth Calloway, Caleb said. I'll go to her tonight. Don't go alone, Clara said immediately. Finch already knows you're in this. If you're seen riding into town alone tonight, it looks like you're building a case, and he'll move to cut off your witnesses before I can depose them. Then how— Tomas, she said. Tomas goes to Ruth Calloway. He's not the man Finch is watching. He's a ranch hand running an errand. She looked at Caleb. Send him tonight, after dark. Tell him to go through the back of Main Street and not to tie his horse in front of the boarding house. Caleb looked at her. You've done this before. I've dealt with men like Aldous Finch before, Clara said. Different counties, different names, same structure. A respected man, a legal framework he controls, and victims who have no standing to challenge him because he's made sure they have no standing before the situation ever becomes visible. Something in her voice was steady and contained, and had been steady and contained over something considerable for a long time. I find I have very little patience left for that particular structure. Nora was watching Clara with an expression that Caleb hadn't seen on her yet. Not the careful watchfulness, not the managed stillness. Something more open than either of those. The expression of someone recognizing, for the first time, that the person across from them has lived something they understand. Miss Webb, Nora said quietly, did you— She stopped. Clara looked at her. Did I what? Did you have someone like Finch in your own life? A pause. Clara's pen stilled. My first employer, Clara said, when I was reading law in Austin. A man who believed that a woman learning law was a novelty he was indulging, and that the indulgence came with terms he didn't feel the need to state out loud. She held Nora's gaze. I was 23. I had no family in Austin, and no money, and no standing, and he knew all 3 of those things very well. She paused. I found a different way out than you did. But I understand the arithmetic of it. I understand exactly what it costs to stay and what it costs to run. The kitchen was very quiet. I ran, Nora said. Yes, Clara said. And you took the evidence, which means you're smarter at 22 than I was at 23. She picked her pen back up. Now let's use it. Tomas came back from the east fence line 20 minutes later and accepted his new assignment without comment, in the manner of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that working for Caleb Harrow meant the job description was subject to change without notice. He was back on his horse and heading for town before the sun had fully dropped. What none of them knew, because Finch was careful and Finch was fast, and Finch had 20 years of practice at moving before the other side was ready, was that Cole Dray had been sitting on the hill above the eastern road since 2 in the afternoon, watching, counting horses coming and going, noting the woman who had arrived hard from the direction of Harlan and stayed. And now Dray was riding back to Finch's house with everything he'd seen. The knock on the front door came at 8 in the evening. Not the pounding of a desperate girl in a storm. Measured. Official. The knock of someone who has decided that courtesy is still useful as a performance, even when they've moved past it as a genuine intention. Caleb answered it. Sheriff Braddock stood on the porch, alone this time, without the hired man, but with a folded paper in his hand, and the expression of someone who had lost a small internal argument on the way over, and was still sore about it. Caleb, Braddock said, I've got a paper here. Judge Ames signed it an hour ago. Caleb looked at the paper without taking it. What kind of paper? Order for the return of a dependent minor to her legal guardian. Braddock's voice was flat. Aldous Finch filed a sworn complaint this afternoon, stating that you are knowingly harboring his ward against his legal authority and against her own best interests. He paused. Judge Ames reviewed the original guardian contract and found it in order. Judge Ames reviewed the county filing, Clara said from behind Caleb's left shoulder. Braddock blinked. He hadn't seen her. He looked at Caleb. Clara Webb, Caleb said, attorney, retained by me this afternoon. Braddock looked at Clara. Clara looked at Braddock with the polite, implacable expression of a person who has read more case law than he has and is not going to make a performance of it. Sheriff, Clara said, the filing that Judge Ames reviewed is a fraudulent document that differs materially from the contract signed by the deceased Reverend Bellwether. I have both documents in my possession. I am prepared to present them to Judge Ames himself tomorrow morning before 9 o'clock, along with a sworn statement from a witness to the original signing, documentation of physical abuse committed by the purported guardian, and evidence of a separately forged document bearing Mr. Harrow's signature that was filed without his knowledge or consent. She paused. You are welcome to serve that order, but I want you to understand that the moment you serve it, you become part of the public record of this proceeding, and the question of whether you served it in good faith or in coordination with a man engaged in document fraud will be a question a judge is going to have an opinion about. Braddock stood very still. I'm not asking you to decide tonight which side of this you're on, Clara continued. I'm asking you to wait until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, come to the courthouse, and let me put everything I have in front of Judge Ames in your presence. If the judge reviews the evidence and still orders the girl returned, I will not obstruct that order. She looked at him steadily. But I think the judge is going to have a different opinion by 9:15. Braddock looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at Caleb. He looked past both of them toward the lamp-lit kitchen where Eli was visible at the table and Nora Bellwether was sitting beside him with her hands folded, waiting. The bruise on her face was visible from the doorway. Braddock looked at it for a moment. Just one moment. Then he looked back at the order in his hand, with the expression of a man who has been doing the easy thing for 20 years, and is standing at the exact point where the easy thing and the right thing have finally separated far enough that he can't pretend they're still the same road. 9 o'clock, he said. 9 o'clock, Clara confirmed. He folded the paper and put it back in his coat. He put his hat on. He looked at Caleb one more time, and in his face was something that was not quite an apology and not quite a declaration, but was somewhere in between and meant more for being neither one cleanly. You'd better have what she says you have, he said. We have it, Caleb said. Braddock stepped off the porch and walked to his horse and rode back toward town without looking back. Caleb closed the door. The four of them, Caleb, Clara, Nora, and Eli, who had appeared silently in the kitchen doorway, stood in the quiet of the front hall, and no one spoke for a moment. Then Eli said, "Is it going to be okay?" Caleb looked at his son. He looked at Nora, who was looking at the closed door with the expression of someone who has been holding a breath for a very long time, and still doesn't quite believe it's safe to let it out. "We've got until morning," Caleb said. He looked at Clara. "What do we need to do tonight?" Clara was already writing in her leather book. "Everything," she said. "We need to do everything tonight." She looked up. "Start with the forged letter. I want you to write out a full account of every interaction you've had with Finch about that water access over the past 2 years. Every conversation, every date you can remember, every witness who was present." "All right." "Nora," Clara looked at her directly, "I need you to write down what you told me today, every detail, in your own words, your own hand. Don't make it a legal document. Write it the way you'd tell it to someone sitting across from you who needed to understand." She paused. "Judges are people. They respond to the truth told plainly more than they respond to legal language, especially when the legal language has been used to obscure the truth for a long time." Nora pulled a piece of paper toward her. "And Eli," Clara said. The boy looked at her. "You've been very patient and very quiet, and that is a genuine skill that most adults don't have," she said. "You should go to bed." Eli considered arguing. He looked at his father. Caleb raised his eyebrows. The boy slid off the bench, paused, and looked at Nora. "Good night, Miss Bellwether," he said, with the deliberate courtesy of a child who has decided to like someone and wants them to know it. "Good night, Eli," she said. Her voice was soft, and something in it was slightly unsteady. "Thank you for the biscuit at lunch." He nodded seriously, as if the biscuit had been intentional strategy rather than the impulse of an 8-year-old who noticed someone hadn't eaten enough, and went upstairs without further argument. Caleb listened to his son's boots on the stairs and looked across the table at Nora Bellwether, who was already writing, head bent, her pen moving across the page in the steady, deliberate way she did everything that mattered. Clara was writing across from her. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the Texas night pressed in hot and close. And somewhere out there, Aldous Finch was thinking fast and making plans, and had until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to find a way to make this disappear. Caleb picked up his own pen. He thought about the forged letter with his name on it. He thought about a girl pounding on his door in a thunderstorm. He thought about Eli's face when he'd asked if it was going to be okay, and the particular weight of being the person a child looked at when they needed to know if the world was going to hold. He started writing. Outside, the summer dark settled over Dusty Creek, and Tomas Reyes moved quietly through the back streets toward Ruth Calloway's boarding house, and the stars came out hard and bright over the Texas plain the way they always did after a storm, indifferent to what was happening underneath them, but present nonetheless, burning their steady light over everything, the honest and the dishonest, the frightened and the brave, and the small lamplit kitchen where 3 people were writing down the truth and getting ready for morning. Tomas came back at 11. He came in through the back door the way he always did, set his hat on the counter, and stood for a moment looking at the 3 of them still at the table, with the lamp burning low and papers spread between them like a map of everything they needed to prove before morning. "Ruth Calloway will be at the courthouse at 9, he said. "She didn't need convincing. She asked me 2 questions. Was the girl safe? And was Caleb Harrow standing behind her? And when I said yes to both, she told me she'd been waiting for someone to come to her door since the Sunday she saw that bruise and did nothing about it." He paused. "She said she's been carrying that particular weight for 3 weeks, and she's ready to put it down." Nora looked up from the page she was writing. Something moved through her face that she didn't entirely catch in time. "She doesn't even know me," Nora said quietly. "She knows enough," Tomas said. "She knows what she saw." Clara didn't look up from her own writing. "Did she know about Margaret Tillis?" "She said Margaret Tillis would come if Ruth asked her. Said Margaret's been scared, but that she's more scared of what it means that she stayed quiet than she is of Finch at this point." Tomas looked at Caleb. Ruth's words were, and I'm giving them to you exact. She said a town that watches a young woman get hurt and calls it somebody else's problem isn't a town worth living in. And she said she's lived in Dusty Creek her whole life, and she'd like to still be proud of it when she's done. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Good," Clara said. She wrote something down. "That's the kind of woman a judge listens to." Caleb looked at Tomas. "Sykes, the county clerk." Tomas sat down. "That one's more complicated. Sykes knows what he processed. I don't think he understood the full shape of it when he did it. I think Finch handed him papers and told him it was routine, and Sykes stamped them because Sykes has been stamping Finch's routine papers for 8 years, and it never occurred to him to read them closely. He paused. But he knows now. Finch went to see him this afternoon, after he came back from here. Clem's boy was at the feed store next door and heard them through the wall.
"What did Finch say to him?" Clara asked.
Told him to keep his mouth shut and his office closed tomorrow morning. Told him there was a woman from Harlan making trouble, and that if Sykes cooperated with her, he'd find his brother-in-law's position at the Mercantile reconsidered. Tomas looked at Clara. Sykes has got a wife and 3 children, and that job is the only steady income in the family beyond his clerk's salary. Clara set her pen down. "So Finch already knows I'm here." "He's known since afternoon," Caleb said. Dre was watching the road. "All right." She was quiet for a moment, not distressed, just recalibrating the way she did everything. Fast, without wasted motion. Sykes being silenced actually helps us, because a man who's been told to stay quiet by the person who filed papers through his office is a man whose silence is evidence of coordination. She looked at Caleb. "I don't need Sykes to talk tomorrow morning. I need him to show up."
If he's in that courtroom, and Finch is in that courtroom, and the judge asks Sykes directly whether he received instructions from Finch about tomorrow's proceedings, Gerald Sykes is going to have to choose between perjury and the truth. And I don't think Gerald Sykes has the stomach for perjury under oath in front of a judge.
"You're going to put him on the spot," Nora said. "I'm going to give him a way out that doesn't require him to be brave," Clara said. "There's a difference. Brave is asking too much of a frightened man. A clear exit is something most people can manage." She picked her pen back up. "Caleb, is your account finished?" "Nearly." "Nora?" "Yes." Nora straightened the pages in front of her. 4 pages, both sides, the handwriting even and controlled all the way through. She slid them across to Clara, who picked them up and read them standing, quickly, her eyes moving fast. When she finished, she set the pages down and looked at Nora with an expression that was purely professional, and underneath the professionalism was something quieter and more personal. "This is good," Clara said. "This is very good. You write the way you talk, plainly, in order, without reaching for effect." She paused. "A judge is going to read this and believe every word because it doesn't sound like someone trying to convince him of anything. It sounds like someone telling him what happened." Nora looked at the pages. "It's just what happened." "Yes," Clara said. "That's exactly what makes it good." They worked until past midnight. Clara reorganized everything into an order that built the case the way a structure gets built. Foundation first, then walls, then the roof, and talked them through it as she went, so that Caleb and Nora both understood not just what they had, but why it mattered in the sequence she was presenting it. Caleb asked questions when he had them. Nora asked fewer questions, but better ones. The kind that went to the heart of the logic, rather than the surface of it. And more than once, Clara paused and looked at her and said simply, "Yes, exactly," with the tone of someone who does not give that answer lightly. At one point, Tomas fell asleep in his chair at the end of the table, arms folded, chin down, with the instant complete unconsciousness of a man who has spent 40 years in physical labor and whose body knows how to take rest when rest is available. Nobody woke him. Around 1 in the morning, Nora set down the cup she'd been holding and said, "Can I ask you something?" She was looking at Caleb. Clara was at the counter, rereading the forged letter, and gave no indication of listening, which Caleb had already noticed was her way of offering privacy without making a performance of it. "Go ahead," he said. "Your wife," she said. "Martha." The name landed the way it always did, with that specific gravity. He didn't flinch from it, but he felt it. "You haven't talked about her much," Nora said. "Not since this morning when you mentioned the hiding spot in the barn." She paused. "I'm not asking out of I'm not trying to open something that's closed. She stopped. Try again. I have been in your house for nearly 24 hours, and I can feel her in it. The bench in the front room. The way Eli sets his fork down exactly the same way on the right side of the plate every time, like someone taught him that specific thing. She held his gaze. I just want you to know that I notice, that I know this house belongs to someone who isn't here anymore, and I'm not pretending otherwise. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Martha was practical, he said. That's the first thing. Before anything else, the kindness, the stubbornness, the way she could make Tomas laugh when nobody else could. She was the most practical person I've ever known. She didn't waste motion. She didn't waste words. She had a clear eye for what was necessary, and she did the necessary thing without making a fuss about it. He paused. I miss her practicality more than I know how to say. Grief is not practical at all, and I think she'd have found that deeply irritating. Nora's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, warm and a little sad. She sounds like she was wonderful, she said. She was difficult and wonderful in about equal measure, Caleb said, which is the right proportion, I think, for a person worth knowing. He looked at his hands on the table. She would have had an opinion about all of this, about you, about Finch, about what I should do. She always had an opinion. He paused. I've been trying to figure out for 5 years how to have opinions without her to argue them against. Is it getting easier? Nora asked. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without softening it into something safer. Slowly, he said. It gets easier slowly, and not in a straight line. He looked at her. Your father, is that? Yes, she said quietly. Not in a straight line. They sat with that for a moment, the simple shared knowledge of it, and it was one of those moments that doesn't need words built on top of it. Clara set the forged letter down on the counter. Get some sleep, she said, without turning around. Both of you. I need you clear-headed in that courtroom, and right now you're running on nothing. She picked up her own papers. I'll be up at 5. Tomas? She raised her voice slightly. Tomas's head came up immediately, eyes open, fully awake in 1 second. You're driving the wagon to town in the morning, 6:30. Yes, ma'am, Tomas said, entirely without embarrassment at having been observed sleeping. Caleb looked at Nora. She's right. Nora looked at the papers on the table, the organized case that Clara had built, the 4 pages of her own handwriting that described 8 months of her life in plain sentences. She put her hand flat on them for a moment. The same gesture she used for things she needed to feel were real. All right, she said. She went down the hall. Caleb listened to the quiet click of the bolt on the back room door and felt the house settle around it. He sat at the table for a few more minutes by himself, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the quiet be what it was. Then he went upstairs and checked on Eli, who was deeply asleep, with one arm hanging off the bed in the boneless way of children who have not yet learned to sleep like adults. And Caleb straightened the boy's arm and pulled the thin summer blanket up, and stood there for a moment, in the dark, looking at his son's face. He thought about what Eli had said at the fence. Mr. Finch has mean eyes. 8 years old, and he'd seen it plain as daylight. Martha had been like that too. Saw people clearly without needing to be told. He went to his room and lay on top of the covers in the heat and looked at the ceiling and thought about 9 o'clock and what it would mean if it went right and what it would mean if it didn't. And somewhere in the middle of that thinking, he fell asleep without noticing the line where wakefulness ended. The courthouse in Dusty Creek was a square, serious building on the north end of Main Street that smelled like old paper and lemon oil, and the particular gravity of official things. Judge Ames held his proceedings in a room on the second floor, with 4 rows of benches and a tall window behind his desk that let in the morning light at an angle that made everything look either very honest or very exposed, depending on what you'd come to say.
By 8:45, the benches had more people in them than a routine 9 o'clock proceeding had any business attracting. Ruth Calloway was in the second row, solid and upright, with Margaret Tillis beside her. Margaret was a slight woman in her 40s, who had the look of someone who had spent the last 3 weeks working up to something and had decided this morning was the morning. She sat with her hands folded and her jaw set and did not look at the door. Tomas was at the back. A man named Pete Garland, who ran the hardware store on the east side of Maine and had apparently been recruited by Ruth Calloway between last night and this morning, for reasons Caleb didn't fully understand but didn't question, sat 2 rows behind Ruth with his hat in his hands. Gerald Sykes was not present. His office downstairs was locked. Aldous Finch arrived at 8:50 with his attorney, Holt, a lean, dry man who had the bearing of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds, and 2 members of the county board who had no official role in the proceeding, but whose presence was clearly intended to communicate something about weight and standing. Finch looked at the room, registered the benches, registered Ruth Calloway, and his face went through something quick and controlled before the board meeting expression came back into place. He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him and said nothing. Nora sat beside Clara at the small table to the left of the judge's desk. She had borrowed a dress from Clara. Plain, well-made, exactly the right choice for a room like this. She sat straight and still, and the bruise on her face had darkened to the full range of its colors overnight. Purple and green and yellow at the edges, and she did not cover it, and she did not turn away from it, and she let it be exactly what it was in the full morning light, where every person in that room could see it. Caleb watched Finch look at it, watched him recalibrate. Judge Ames came in at exactly 9 o'clock. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his 60s, with the manner of someone who had been doing this long enough that he had no patience for performance on either side, and a considerable amount of patience for the truth. He looked at the room. He looked at both tables. He looked at Nora. He sat down. I have before me a petition for the enforcement of a guardian order filed by Aldous Finch regarding one Nora Bellwether, he said. I also have, as of this morning, a counterfiling submitted by Clara Webb, attorney, on behalf of Miss Bellwether, challenging the validity of the original guardian arrangement on the grounds of document fraud. He set both files on the desk in front of him. Miss Webb, you filed this morning. You go first. Holt started to stand. Judge Ames looked at him. Holt sat back down. Clara stood. She was composed and unhurried in the way of someone who is prepared for every version of this conversation and is not surprised by any of them. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to begin by placing 2 documents side by side. The first is the contract that Reverend James Bellwether signed in the presence of 2 witnesses on the 12th of April of this year. The second is the document filed with this county's clerk's office under Mr. Finch's name on the 14th of April, 2 days later, which purports to be the same agreement. She laid both documents on the judge's desk. Judge Ames looked at them. He read the first page of each. He turned to the second pages. He went back to the first pages. He did this without expression, but his stillness had the quality of a man who is finding what he expected to find and is not pleased about it. These are not the same document, he said. No, Your Honor, Clara said. They are not. Holt was on his feet. Your Honor, the authenticity of those documents has not been established. The first document bears the signatures of 2 witnesses,
Clara said, without raising her voice. "Both of whom are present in this room today, and prepared to confirm what they signed and when." She looked at Ruth Calloway and Margaret Tillis. Both women sat straight. Margaret's hands were shaking slightly. She didn't look away. "Mr. Finch," Judge Ames said. He did not look up from the documents. Finch stood. He had the board meeting voice fully engaged, warm and reasonable. The voice of a man who has walked into difficult rooms before and talked his way back out of them. "Your Honor, I want to assure you that any discrepancy between those documents is the result of a clerical error that occurred during the filing process and has nothing to do with—" "A clerical error," Judge Ames said. He looked up for the first time. "Mr. Finch, the language in the filed document transfers full title of the Bellwether property to you. The language in the original document does not. That is not a clerical error. That is a different document." The room went quiet. Finch's attorney leaned in and said something low. Finch's jaw was tight, but his expression held. "Your Honor," Holt said, "my client is prepared to address any inconsistencies through a full audit of the filing process. We would ask that this matter be continued to allow time for—" "There's a second matter," Clara said. She picked up the forged letter. "This document was filed with the county clerk's office in July of this year. It bears the signature of Caleb Harrow and purports to be an agreement by Mr. Harrow to sell water access rights to Aldous Finch. Mr. Harrow is present in this room and will state under oath that he did not sign this document, has never agreed to the sale of those water rights, and had no knowledge of this document's existence until yesterday." She set it on the judge's desk. "I would characterize this as a forgery, executed to remove the last legal obstacle between Mr. Finch and a fraudulent appropriation of the Bellwether land." She said it plainly, the way Nora wrote, without reaching for effect, because the effect was already there in the facts. The room behind them had the particular quality of absolute silence that means everyone in it is holding very still. Finch stood up. He didn't wait for his attorney. The board meeting warmth was gone entirely now, and what was under it was not rage. It was something colder and more calculating and more frightening than rage. "Your Honor," he said, "I have given 20 years to this county, 20 years of civic investment, charitable work, employment for this community, and I am standing here being accused of fraud by a young woman with no family and no standing, represented by an attorney brought in from outside this county specifically to make trouble, on the basis of documents that have not been properly authenticated." "Mr. Harrow," Judge Ames looked at Caleb. Caleb stood. "Is that your signature on that letter?" "No, Your Honor," Caleb said. "It is not." "Have you ever agreed verbally or in writing to sell water access rights on your South Creek drainage to Aldous Finch or to any other party?" "No, Your Honor." "Have you at any point had any communication with Mr. Finch about the Bellwether land or the spring on that property?" "Mr. Finch told me 2 years ago that the spring was likely to be absorbed into a water access arrangement he was finalizing with an adjacent property owner," Caleb said. "I told him I had no such arrangement and that I would not be entering into one. He did not raise it again with me directly." He paused. He apparently chose a different approach. Finch's attorney grabbed his arm. Finch pulled it free. "She came to you," Finch said. He was looking at Caleb, and his voice had dropped to something almost conversational, which was worse than shouting. "She showed up at your door, and she told you a story, and you believed it, because she's young, and she looks—" He stopped himself. "Because she looks like what?" Caleb asked. His voice was quiet and level, and did not move. The room was completely still. Finch looked at him. In his face, underneath everything, the calculation, the exposure, the cold assessment of how to salvage what was left, There was something that might have been the first honest thing Caleb had seen from him. Not remorse, not shame, but the recognition, finally, of a man who has walked into a room expecting to control it and has understood that he doesn't. "Your Honor," Clara said, "I'd also like to call Ruth Calloway." Ruth Calloway stood without waiting to be asked. She walked to the front of the room with the deliberate, solid step of a woman who has made up her mind and is done unmaking it. She turned to face the room and looked at Finch and said, without being asked any question at all, "I saw that girl at Sunday service 3 weeks ago with a bruise on her neck she was trying to cover with her collar. I knew what it was. I knew where it came from. And I went home and I told myself it wasn't my place." Her voice was steady and it carried.
I am here this morning because it is my place. It is every person in this room's place. And I am sorry it took me 3 weeks to understand that. Margaret Tillis was crying quietly in the second row. Not from distress, from something that looked like relief. Judge Ames looked at Finch for a long moment. He looked at Holt. He looked at the 2 county board members in the back row who had come to lend weight and were now sitting very still with the careful expressions of men deciding how thoroughly to distance themselves from the situation they'd walked into. "Mr. Finch," the judge said, "I am issuing an immediate injunction against any action regarding the Bellwether property, pending a full fraud investigation. I am also referring the matter of the forged document to the county prosecutor." He looked at Holt. "Your client is free to go." I would strongly suggest you counsel him carefully about his options, because they have become considerably more limited in the last 30 minutes. Finch stood at his table. He was still for one long moment, and in that stillness, Caleb watched him process the collapse of something he had built carefully over a long time. And he watched Finch do what men like Finch do. Not accept it, not feel shame for it, but file it away as a temporary setback to be managed and redirected. He was already thinking about what came next. Caleb could see it happening. But what came next was going to happen in a courtroom, with Clara Webb across the table, and Caleb Harrow's name on the case, and Ruth Calloway willing to stand up in public and say what she'd seen. And Aldous Finch, for the first time in 20 years in Dusty Creek, was going to have to fight that from the weaker side of the room. Finch picked up his hat. He looked at Nora one time, a single, direct look. And what was in it was not anything as simple as anger. It was the look of a man who has always believed that the world arranged itself according to his convenience, and has just been shown, clearly and publicly, that it doesn't. Nora held his gaze without flinching, without fear, without anger either. She held it the way she held everything she'd decided to face, squarely, clearly, with the full weight of herself behind her eyes. Finch walked out. The room let out its breath all at once, the collective exhale of a crowd that has been holding itself very carefully and has finally been given permission to stop. Clara sat down beside Nora and said something quiet and direct, and Nora nodded, and Caleb watched her hands on the table, no longer flat and braced, just resting, just present. Just ordinary hands on a wooden surface on a Tuesday morning in late summer. Ruth Calloway came through the small gate at the bar of the room and stood in front of Nora and said, "I'm Ruth Calloway. I'm sorry I took so long." Nora looked up at her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "That's all that matters." Ruth sat down in the empty chair beside her, and the two of them began talking in the low, direct way of women who have been through different versions of the same thing and recognize each other clearly. Caleb stood at the back of the room with Tomas and let himself have 30 seconds of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, something quieter than that. The specific satisfaction of a thing done right.
of having stood up when standing was required, of having meant what he said. "You all right?" Tomas said. "Yes," Caleb said. "The boy's going to want to hear everything. He'll hear what's appropriate for 8 years old. He's going to want more than that. He always does." Caleb looked across the room at Nora talking to Ruth Calloway, at Clara making notes with her quick, efficient pen, at Margaret Tillis wiping her eyes and smiling at the same time. He looked at the judge gathering his papers, at the 2 board members slipping out the back with the careful speed of men who had made a decision about which version of this morning they were going to tell people about. He thought about the drive back to the ranch, about Eli waiting at the fence the way he'd taken to doing when Caleb was in town, standing on the second rail, watching the road, about the kitchen table and the lamp and the oilcloth packet that had started all of this. A girl with the presence of mind to take the evidence, and the courage to run with it, and the judgment to knock on a door in a storm, and trust that what answered would be worth trusting. He thought about what she'd said last night, about grief not moving in a straight line. He thought about how a house could be empty for 5 years, and then full again in 24 hours, and how the fullness was not a replacement for anything, but was its own thing entirely, new and different, and asking to be taken on its own terms. He was not ready to examine all of what that meant, but he was done pretending it wasn't there. Tomas was looking at him with a patient expression of a man waiting for the person in front of him to finish thinking. "Let's go home," Caleb said. The ride back to the ranch was quiet in the way that follows something large. Clara sat in the front of the wagon beside Tomas and spent most of the ride writing in her leather book, which Caleb had already understood was how she processed things, by turning them immediately into next steps, into the practical shape of what came after. She had a criminal referral to prepare, and depositions to arrange, and a fraud case to build that would take months and would require Nora to stand up in front of a courtroom more than once and say the same hard things she'd already said today. She had told Nora this plainly on the courthouse steps. No softening, same as always. Nora had said, "I know. Tell me what you need." Nora sat in the back of the wagon beside Caleb and said very little, which he'd come to understand was not absence, but presence. She was thinking, the way she always thought, completely and without distraction. And the silence between them had the comfortable quality of silence between people who have stopped needing to fill it. After a while, she said, "He's going to try again." "Yes," Caleb said. "Not in the courtroom. Outside it." She looked at her hands. Men like him don't accept the courtroom when the courtroom goes against them. They look for the leverage that exists outside the legal record. "Clara knows that," Caleb said. "She's going to move fast on the criminal referral precisely because speed removes the window he'd need." "And Sykes?" "Sykes didn't show up this morning," Caleb said, "which means he's scared of both sides right now and hasn't decided which one scares him more. Clara will get to him before Finch can consolidate that fear in one direction." He looked at her. "She's very good at this." "I know," Nora said. "I can see it." A pause. "I want to be good at it. What she does. The way she thinks." She said it quietly, not as a wish exactly, more as something she was saying out loud for the first time to see how it sounded. "I've been thinking about it since last night. The way she organized everything. The way she knew which piece of information to put where to make the whole structure hold." Caleb looked at her. "You think like that already?" "I think like that about problems I already understand," she said. "She thinks like that about problems she's never seen before. That's different." She paused. "My father wanted me to be a school teacher. He thought that was the right shape for me." "What do you think is the right shape?" She was quiet for a moment. I think I want to be the person in the room who knows more than the person trying to take advantage of somebody who doesn't. She looked at him steadily. I think I've been that person on the wrong side of a desk, and I'd like to be on the other side. Caleb looked at the road ahead. The ranch gate was visible in the distance, and on the second rail of the fence beside it, exactly where he'd expected, was a small figure with dark hair and his father's way of standing, feet planted, watching the road with full attention. "Tell Clara that," Caleb said. "What you just told me. Tell her tonight, before she goes back to Harlan." Nora followed his gaze to the fence and the boy on the rail. "Why?" "Because Clara Webb has been doing this work alone for 3 years, and she has a mind that runs faster than one person's caseload can keep up with," he said. "And because you took 4 pages of complicated legal evidence and organized it into plain language that made a judge believe every word." He glanced at her. "Tell her." Eli saw them when the wagon was still 100 yards out and dropped off the fence rail and ran, which was not dignified, but was entirely honest. And Caleb stepped down from the wagon before Tomas had fully stopped it, and crouched at the right moment so that the boy hit him square in the chest at full speed, and he wrapped both arms around his son and held on, and felt the particular weight of everything the last 36 hours had been settle into something he could carry. "Did it work?" Eli said into his shoulder. "Yes," Caleb said. "It worked." The boy pulled back and looked at his face, checking, the way children check when they need to know if what they're being told is the full truth or the version that has been made easier for them. He must have found the full truth, because he nodded, once, the same decisive nod Martha used to use, and then turned and looked at Nora getting down from the wagon. "Miss Bellwether," he said, with the gravity of someone conducting an important briefing. "The cats got out of the barn while you were gone. I put them back, but the gray one is still mad about it." Nora looked at this boy, who had woken up 2 days ago to a stranger at his breakfast table, and had, without any instruction from anyone, decided to simply include her. And something happened in her face that she didn't try to manage at all. "I'll go talk to her," Nora said. "The gray one always seemed like the reasonable one to me." "She's not," Eli said seriously. "She just looks like it." He fell into step beside her toward the barn, already explaining the full complexity of the cat situation, and Caleb watched them go and stood in the yard in the afternoon heat and felt something in his chest settle the rest of the way down. Tomas appeared at his shoulder. "Don't say anything," Caleb said. "I was going to say the south fence needs checking before dark," Tomas said. "But also, your face is doing that thing it does." "What thing?" "The thing it did the morning after Eli was born," Tomas said. "When you came out of the bedroom and you didn't know what to do with your hands." He picked up the harness he'd unhooked from the wagon. "I'm just noting it for the record." He walked to the barn without waiting for a response. Clara stayed for supper. It was Nora who made it. Beans and cornbread and sliced salt pork. And she did it the way she did things, efficiently and without fuss, moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had been in it longer than 2 days, which she had not, but which the kitchen seemed to have accepted regardless. Eli sat on the counter and talked at her the entire time she cooked, and she answered every question he asked, including the ones about whether cats had opinions about cornbread, without condescension and without impatience. And Caleb sat at the table with Clara and watched this happening and thought about the word home and what it actually meant when you stripped away the legal definition. Over supper, Clara laid out the timeline for the case. Criminal referral to the county prosecutor within 48 hours. Deposition from Nora, from Caleb, from Ruth Calloway and Margaret Tillis within the week. Sykes she would handle separately, in private, with the exit ramp already prepared. The board members who had attended the courthouse that morning and then disappeared. She was going to let them sit with their discomfort for 48 hours, and then pay them a visit. Because a scared man given a clear way out was a cooperative man, and right now, half the county infrastructure that Finch had used was occupied by scared men looking for exits. Finch himself, she said, had 3 options, and she had thought through all 3 and had a strategy for each. The most likely was that he would attempt to challenge the fraud charge on technical grounds, arguing that the filed document was a legitimate amendment to the original contract that had been improperly communicated. This was weak, and she could dismantle it, but it would take time. The second option was that he would attempt to relocate assets before the injunction was fully enforced, which was why she needed to move fast on the property freeze. The third, and most dangerous, was that he would find a different kind of pressure, something outside the legal record, something personal. What kind of personal? Nora asked. Your father's reputation, Clara said directly. He signed a contract he didn't fully understand while he was dying. Finch's attorney will try to characterize that as negligence or gullibility or worse, and they will do it in a public record where it will sit permanently. She held Nora's gaze. I want you prepared for that. It is not true, and I will fight it. But I need you to know it's coming so it doesn't land on you unprepared. Nora's jaw went tight, just for a second. Then it released. My father was a good man who trusted someone he shouldn't have. That's not negligence. That's decency. She paused. Let them say it. I'll answer it. Clara looked at her. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she went back to her food with the expression of someone filing something important. After supper, while Tomas washed up and Eli was persuaded upstairs with minimal negotiation, Clara stood on the porch with Nora, and they talked for 20 minutes in low voices that Caleb didn't try to hear. He sat at the kitchen table and drank his coffee and heard the occasional sentence float through the screen door. Clara's voice, efficient and direct, and then Nora's, asking something, and then Clara's again, slower this time, with a different quality in it. The quality of a woman saying something she means personally rather than professionally. When Nora came back inside, her face was different. Not the careful, managed stillness, not the open rawness of the courthouse. Something quieter and more settled. The expression of someone who has been handed something they didn't expect and is figuring out where it fits. She sat down across from Caleb and folded her hands on the table. She offered to take me on, Nora said. As a clerk, to start. Reading cases, organizing evidence, learning the structure of it. She paused. In Harlan. She has a small practice, and she said she's been looking for someone with... She stopped. She said she's been looking for someone who thinks plainly and doesn't frighten easily. Caleb looked at her. What did you say? I said I needed time to think about it. She met his eyes. I said there were things here I needed to settle first, before I made any decisions about where I was going. The kitchen was quiet. The land, he said. Among other things, she said. He looked at his hands on the table. He thought about what he'd told her 2 days ago, that he'd spent 5 years making his life small enough that nothing else could hurt him. He thought about how he'd said it like it was a confession, and she'd received it like it was information, useful and important and worth knowing, the way she received everything. The land borders mine, he said. I know. The spring that runs through it waters my south pasture. I've been managing that water informally for 3 years because the Bellwether property had no one actively working it. He paused. I'd like to formalize that. A documented agreement. Fair terms, equal footing, your name on the deed, the way your grandfather's name was on the original filing. Nora looked at him. You're offering me a partnership. I'm offering you the starting point of one, he said carefully. The land arrangement first. Legal, documented, witnessed, everything written down and clear. Nothing that requires you to take anything on faith. He held her gaze. And I'm telling you that whatever else develops from that, or doesn't, will move at whatever pace makes sense. I'm not in a hurry. I've been still for 5 years. I can be patient. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with that full, clear-eyed attention that had been reading him since the first moment she'd opened her eyes on his floor.
"You've been alone a long time," she said.
Yes.
"And you're not lonely in the way that makes people rush at the first thing that feels warm," she said. "You're lonely in the way that makes people careful, the way that knows the difference between something real and something that just looks like it from far away."
She paused.
"I want you to know that I see the difference too, that I'm not—" She stopped. "I don't want to be someone's answer to an empty house. I want to be—"
"I know what you want to be," he said. Quiet, certain. You want to be a person in a room who knows more than the one trying to take advantage. You want your name on your own things. You want to build something that is yours, the way your grandmother built something that was hers. He looked at her steadily. None of that, and what I'm saying, are in conflict. They never were. Nora breathed in slowly. Her hands were still on the table, not braced, not gripping, just resting.
"Clara's offer," she said.
"If I took it, Harlan is 2 hours east. I know. I'd be back and forth. There would be weeks where I wasn't here. I managed 5 years of empty," he said. "I can manage weeks of back and forth." The corner of her mouth moved. "You say that like it's simple." "It's not simple," he said. "I'm saying it's manageable. Those are different things." He looked at her. "The land will still be here. The partnership will still be here. And when you've learned what you want to learn from Clara, and you know exactly what you want to do with what you know, that will still be here too." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the summer dark was coming down over Dusty Creek the way it always came down in July. Fast and heavy and warm, pressing in from every direction. The lamp on the table threw long light across her face, and Caleb looked at it, the bruise that was already beginning to fade at the edges, the steadiness in her eyes that had been there from the first moment and had not once flickered in 2 days of things that would have broken a less rooted person. "My father would have liked you," she said. He liked men who said what they meant without making it bigger than it was. "He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was the best man I knew," she said, "until very recently." She said it without decoration, without looking away, the way she said things that cost her something to say. The kitchen held that for a moment. Caleb looked at the lamp flame. He thought about Martha, about the bench in the front room and the hiding spot in the barn floor, and the fork set down on the right side of a plate. He thought about how a house could be full of someone who is gone and also have room for something new, and how those two things were not in conflict either. How grief and hope lived in the same space without canceling each other out. The way land could hold last year's roots and this year's grass at the same time, without either one apologizing for the other. He thought about Eli and the fence rail watching the road. About Tomas saying, "Your face is doing that thing." About Ruth Calloway standing up in a courthouse and saying, "It is every person's place." About Clara Webb arriving hard from Harlan at 10 in the morning because Caleb Harrow had asked, and because that was enough. He thought about a girl pounding on his door in a thunderstorm with evidence inside her dress, and the presence of mind to take it with her, and the judgment to know that the light on the other side of that door was worth knocking for. "I'm going to check the front gate," Nora said. She pushed back from the table and stood. He looked up. "Martha's ironwork," she said simply. "You told me about it. I'd like to see it." He got up and followed her to the front door and out onto the porch, and they walked together to the front gate of the Harrow Ranch in the summer dark. The ironwork was scrolled and careful, the work of a woman who had taken 3 days on it because she believed that the entrance to a thing mattered, that the first impression a place made on the world was worth getting right. Nora put her hand on it, ran her fingers along the scrolled iron the way she touched things she needed to feel were real. She had good taste, Nora said. She had strong opinions, Caleb said, which is mostly the same thing. Nora almost smiled. It was not the almost from breakfast, not the careful almost of a woman managing what she let show. It was the real thing, unguarded and quiet and entirely her own. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The gate was between them, iron and sure, and the summer dark was all around them, and somewhere in the house behind them a lamp burned steady in the window, and an 8-year-old boy slept the boneless sleep of a child who had decided by Tuesday morning that the world had arranged itself correctly and there was nothing further to worry about. "I'll tell Clara yes," Nora said, "in the morning." "All right. And I'll come back when I can, as often as I can." She held his gaze. "The land arrangement. I want it documented before I go. Equal terms, both names, everything written down." "Clara can draw it up tomorrow before she leaves," he said. "Good." She took her hand off the gate. "Then we have a partnership." "We have a partnership," he agreed. She nodded once, the decisive nod, his son's nod, the nod of someone who has made up their mind and means it from the inside out. Then she turned and walked back up the porch steps and inside, and the screen door closed quiet behind her. Caleb stood at the gate. He put his hand where hers had been, on the scrolled iron that Martha had spent 3 days getting right. And he stood there in the summer dark and let himself feel the full size of what the last 2 days had been. The knock in the storm, the bruise in the lamplight, the oilcloth packet and the forged letter, and the courthouse room with the morning light coming through the tall window at an angle that made everything honest, and Eli running down the fence line, and Nora's 4 pages of plain handwriting that made a judge believe every word because it didn't sound like someone trying to convince him of anything. He thought about what she'd said. Until very recently, he thought about it, and he didn't look away from it, and he didn't make it smaller than it was, or larger than it was. And he stood there long enough to mean it, and then he took a breath and pushed off the gate and walked back to the house. The lamp was still burning in the window. He went inside. The Harrow Ranch sat on 2,500 acres of Texas earth, under a sky that had been there long before anyone living had arrived, and would be there long after, indifferent and enduring, and brilliant with stars on a clear July night. 40 acres to the east, running down to a spring that had watered 3 generations of stubborn, clear-eyed women who had put their own names on things and meant it, waited for morning and the paperwork that would make them officially, legally, irrevocably part of the same story. Inside the house, the lamp burned until late, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Harrow was not counting the silence. He was listening to the sound of the house being lived in. A door, a footstep, the small, ordinary sounds of another person present and accounted for, and finding that the sound was not a replacement for anything he had lost, but was its own thing entirely, new and real, and asking nothing of him except that he be willing to let it stay. He was willing. That was enough. That was more than enough. And when morning came over Dusty Creek, with the hard, clean light of a Texas summer day after the storm has passed and the air has finally settled into something a person can breathe, Nora Bellwether sat at the kitchen table with Clara Webb and signed her name at the bottom of 2 documents. One that made her the legal owner of 40 acres of her grandmother's land, held under her own name, the way her grandmother had held it before her, and one that was a letter to Clara Webb, saying yes. Her handwriting was even and clear and did not waver. She signed it the way her grandmother had signed the original deed 60 years before, without asking permission, without looking to see if anyone was watching, with the full and certain weight of a woman who knows exactly what her name is worth, and is done letting anyone else decide.